Peace be upon you, and welcome to this episode of Way Stations, which is the podcast that looks to understand what does it mean to be human in the modern age. We talk about subjects related to art and to culture, to education, history, and religion. And in each episode, I, Rehan Khan, and Dr. Walead Mosaad, my co-host, explore some of these ideas that are shaping human thought and practice. Now, today we're going to look at the subject of moral leadership. And really, questions about morality are often related to what should I do in a particular situation? How shall I react? How should I be thinking? And so on. And so these are dilemmas which I think all of us face in life, whether it's in a family setting, whether it's amongst friends, whether it's in an organizational setting. And so we're going to really look at this question of moral leadership from two frames of reference. Number one is from a faith and a religious perspective, which Dr. Walead is going to speak more about. And then I'm going to add some points as well around looking at this subject from a organization or from a kind of like a management perspective as well. So let's open it up. First of all, let me welcome my co-host, Dr. Walead, and welcome to you. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. Alhamdulillah, how are you?
Very well, very well. I'm good. Thank you so much. So what do we mean then when we talk about moral leadership, when we look at it from a faith-based perspective?
Well, I think it's interesting when you talk about leadership, people generally don't connect it to followership so much, if the word suffices. So, and when we think about leading, we think about kind of tasking others with certain things to achieve a particular goal or objective, whether it be for an organization or for even in a team sport, right? You have captains and you have leaders and you have a coach or a head coach and things like this. So the idea of, I think, leadership in general is something that humanity has accepted as something essential in order to facilitate collaboration, cooperation. Otherwise, we would run into some sort of chaos, and everyone would fend for themselves, and we wouldn't able to navigate our shared resources and our community activities and things that are actually finite in nature. And then, this is when you have conflict and you have difficulties and wars and so forth. So I think, leadership, we all accept the idea about it, but then I think the idea is, well, how do you go about doing it? So my understanding of moral leadership is one that's going to be predicated on a certain set of ethical principles and values and so forth that are going to guide not just individual action, but let's say if there is a collaborative effort to achieve something, an objective, then even all the individuals involved who form part of the team or come under that particular leadership, they're going to try to achieve that. So you can't really have a good leader unless you have good followers too. And I think you can't be a good leader or a moral leader without having been or actively being a follower at the same time. So and I think we have to also recognize our limits and our challenges when it comes to leadership, because in let's say spiritual purification, we talk about something called an allotment for the ego, or hadhin nafs. So there is a huge allotment for the ego in being a leader. And in fact, the spiritual masters, they have a saying that says the last thing to exit, the last, and let's say, spiritual malady, vice to exit from the heart of the righteous people, the believers, is love of leadership. And here, leadership can mean like being out in front, being recognized, being seen as the one who's spearheading the effort and getting the credit and so forth. So there's a huge allotment for the ego there. So I think when we talk about moral leadership, yes, you base it upon ethical principles and values, at least very much theoretically, but then also recognizing your own inconsistencies and your own failings and your own shortcomings, and that you may perceive the situation in a particular way based upon your inherent biases, because your ego is going to get in the way. And we all have that. No one can really truly get away from that entirely. So I think being a leader also means being very introspective and, taking stock of what's going on so far and seeing, am I remaining true to the ethical principles or to the values that we set out and so forth. And I think if you look at great leadership, efforts or models, historically speaking, or in the present day, it's never a one man or a one woman show. There's always going to be people who are supporting them. And, the media scholars and Arabs, when they had, the Sultan who was in charge, they always talked about the role of the Bitana, which would be the people right under the Sultan, or the Wizara, the Wazir, who would be the minister. And it said that if you don't have a bitana salihah, if you don't have a good team with you, doesn't matter how good a leader you're going to be, because you're going to be ultimately affected by that. So I think there's a lot of facets to talk about it. And both, I think you can extend them from like a faith-based perspective, as well as maybe, a modern corporate or management perspective, that you're always only going to be as good as the team that you have. And you're always only going to be as good as your ability to recognize your own faults, I think, within yourself, and able to self-correct and pivot along the way, and not insist upon something that may be ego driven, and recognize within yourself that it may be your ego driving going that particular way. You may have a team member who kind of disagrees with you, and maybe they're on the right path, but because it's that particular team member, you don't really want to accept it, and you may insist upon another course of action. So, but I think that the moral leader has the ability not just to see that they're leading in that way, but also looking at themselves to be able to think about their own course of action in their leadership. And I know, Rehan, that you teach courses on leadership to business professionals and postgraduate students. When I talk a little bit about faith-based, how would you, in the context of management, kind of frame the subject of moral leadership?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think you kind of made some really interesting points there. Especially around the leader and the follower. I hadn't really thought about that. That to be a leader, you must be willing or have experience to have been a follower as well. And then the issue of having an allotment for your ego. I think that was really, really interesting point. Very, very reflective, actually. I think for all of us. Yeah. So to answer, I guess your question. So if you look at this issue of, why do moral failings happen? I suppose that's not a bad place to start. Looking at this question of moral leadership is like, when do things go wrong? And if you look at the kind of briefly history of organizations, going back to the sort of the 17th century, 16th century, these kind of companies like the South Sea Company, Dutch East India Company, these were major corporate scandals of that time. And these were some of the very first joint stock companies. And then you've got in the 21st century, lots of examples of corporate scandals, whether it's Enron or WorldCom or, Tyco or Mahindra Satyam, or in the region here, Abraj Capital, and many, many others. Now, the interesting thing is that before a lot of these corporations actually collapsed due to corruption, right? So moral failings of leadership, people actually running these corporations and the corporations themselves were often seen as the most innovative, the most successful, as the most ethical. And if you look at the business press in the years before many of these companies went down due to corruption, they were often winning prizes for how ethical they were and what a great place to work, and so on and so on. And I suspect if we asked some of these business leaders who, showed a lack of moral discernment and leadership, if you asked them some kind of, questions about whether they thought, is lying wrong or is cheating wrong, they would probably say, yeah, of course it's wrong. And I would suspect their sense of what's right and wrong might not be too far from yours and mine. They would agree, yeah, of course, that you shouldn't do that, that it's wrong. But something happened, something happened in the situation that caused them to perhaps, move off what they would naturally answer. And I think when you look at this question of moral leadership, what these questions are really asking managers to look at, or anyone leading an organization, is what should I do? So in any given situation, what should I do? Should I, for example, show kindness and generosity and respect and honesty and and work hard and so on? And so in a particular situation that I'm facing at work, what should I do? That's often when you have a moral question, that's what you're getting to the root of. What should I do? But I think that if you don't ask a deeper question, which is related to what kind of person should I be, which is more a question of virtue. What kind of person should I be? It's very difficult to answer the question, what should I do? Because what should I do might just change every time. But if you ask a deeper question, what kind of person should I be? Should I really be someone who is trustworthy and someone who is generous and so on? Because if you've asked yourself that question, if you've thought about that question, then when you get to a situation where it's, what should I do? It's obvious. But if you haven't asked yourself that question, then you're likely to go off. And so I think this question of moral leadership is tied in with that deeper question of virtue of what kind of person do I want to be. And that's also then tethered and anchored to a deeper set of beliefs, which is maybe religious beliefs, they may be philosophical beliefs, but they have to be anchored to something. So if you're coming from a faith tradition, that then has to be tied back to your faith. And so I feel that managers and leaders don't really explore this enough in their work, right? So you don't actually see that practice. And of course, the best way to inculcate some of those virtues of what kind of person should I be is to think about, who do I hang out with, right? Who do I spend my time with? Because if I want to become more compassionate, I need to go and spend time with people who are compassionate and so on. And that comes back to your sohbah, your companionship, both at work and elsewhere. So I really feel that the question of that moral leadership is tied to those kind of deeper questions, which perhaps sometimes we don't actually address. But one thing I think I would like to ask you as well is that in business, in organizations, I think the goal of leading an organization is often about, are we being more efficient? Are we returning funds for shareholders? Are we being more profitable? Are we driving up revenue and so on? But how does it work if you're running like a faith-based or a community-based organization?
That's a very, very interesting question, and I appreciate the points that you made earlier about leadership not just being about leading, as it were, but also how are you doing it, and what is your deeper belief system, and what are your values, and are you the one able to inculcate that, not just obviously with other people, but do you have it within yourself? And many of I think the leadership failures that we've seen is people succumbing to the worst part of themselves. Not here to judge them, but I think most people probably set out to do the right thing a lot of the times. But if you have a failure to recognize that you do have the propensity or the potential to slip up, and if you never acknowledge that, then you're more likely to slip up. So if you're not aware of something, then you're not going to be wary of it to avoid it. So I think humility is probably one of the important leadership qualities. When we're talking about how it's done in faith-based projects or initiatives, like I said, it's something I've been thinking about a lot past 20 years or so, being involved with several different faith-based organizations and initiatives and so forth. And how do you measure success, and how do you go about running them? And it's not really about profitability in the sense of returning revenue, but it's probably the main goal is that you achieve your objectives of improving the spiritual life of the people who would be interested in doing that, maybe, is a simple way to put it. And I think in order to do that effectively, you still have to have maybe some sort of set of metrics or something by which you can gauge your progress. But I think it's been quite different than when you have in a for-profit type of endeavor. And I think especially in faith-based projects, it's not always going to be measured quantitatively. One of the examples I always like to use with people is that the Prophet Noah, his faith-based effort lasted 950 years. And he had a total of about 13 followers that were just primarily his family members at the end of it all. So if you go by a quantitative metric, it doesn't look like it was that successful. But at the end of the day, he is referred to as the second father of humanity. So after the Great Flood, him and his progeny who were on the ark, they're our grandparents basically, and they're what remained according both to the biblical narrative and what we know from the Quran. So it's not always about numbers, and I think that's important when you're leading or being a follower in one of these faith-based projects. And sometimes things will manifest in a way that could be immensely impactful and profound and qualitative, but it's hard sometimes to demonstrate that to someone who's thinking in terms of numbers and in terms of quantity. So I think the challenges remain there. And speaking of humility, if you start thinking about, well, how many followers did we get? How many people joined the program? Or how many students do we have? And that sort of thing. And then you start thinking in terms of those metrics and quantity. I think there is a danger there because, you want basically to put forth the best effort that you can and leave the rest up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And, not have, 5-year plan for growth. Some people may disagree, but I feel I'm comfortable with that, to have, these sort of forecasts of how we're going to grow in terms of numbers and things like this. I mean, look at the prophetic model. Look at the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So if you look at the first 13 years of his career when he was in Mecca, from the beginning of his mission, also very few followers, all things considered. He went from a handful in the first few months or years of his mission until they emigrated to Medina, and they numbered about 70 versus a total of about 4,000 to 5,000 people who lived in Mecca. So also, if you were to look at it quantitatively, it was not like much of a success. And then you might even make the argument, looking from an external perspective, that they had to flee where they were, that their da'wah effort was so fraught with difficulty and challenges that they actually had to leave their place of business, as it were, and then go somewhere else. But then you see what that changed into, right? And something that looked like a setback, actually, which was the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, the Sulh of Hudaybiyah, and that even some of the senior Sahaba objected to, including Umar al-Khattab. They said, why are we making this treaty with them, and they won't let us make Umrah this year, if we come back the next year? Are we not upon truth and they're upon falsehood? And the Prophet ﷺ said, this is good, this will be khair. And it said that more people came into the da'wah, entered Islam into the 2.5 ensuing years since the beginning of the treaty than all the people from those 15 years before. So, sometimes if we're going to call it growth, just to borrow that term, it happens in ways that you can't predict and ways that you can't forecast. And so I think ultimately, what I tell people, rather than setting these kind of growth forecasts, we should set intention forecast. I want my intention to be maintained, or my intention to inspire to this thing. I have intention for this thing to reach as many people as possible. Great, that's a great intention. I'm not forecasting it, but that's my intention as we set out, and to bring benefit to those who, inshallah, would have it and seek it. So, that's I think one of the things that we could contrast it with. Some there's a lot we can say about that. The prophetic model of leadership that we just talked about. And I think also in the leadership itself, you may have, for the Prophet ﷺ, he had people obviously who were doing things on his behalf, and people who had, leadership positions under his leadership doing certain things. Certain people would be scribes of the Quran. Certain people would be in charge of military campaigns or organizing armies or organizing teaching. And not every one of the Sahaba was a faqih or so learned that he could teach others. So everyone had a particular role that they would play. But I think part of that leadership, he was developing those people also. So there was an overall objective of bringing this thing forward and fulfilling his prophetic mission. And he had people to help him with that, obviously. And then also, as important, was developing those people who are helping you to bring it forward as well. And I think you find that today. You find people who talk about team making a better team. Even if we take the example of sports, they say that in American football, this term called franchise quarterback or franchise The quarterback is kind of a leader on the offense, and they said a really, really good quarterback is someone who's not just going to play well himself, but also bring the level of his teammates up with him. And then you have this phenomenon also in football, European football, and in other team sports as well. So I'd be interested though, Rehan, because I think we had before we got together with this, we talked a little bit about how corporate culture works with all of this, and you mentioned some of the moral failings, let's say, that happen with many of these companies. Um, but to what extent do you think the modern day corporate culture has a part to play in these moral shortcomings? Is it just a human failing, or would you think it's something more systematic within how we do it? It's the system itself.
Yeah, I know it's interesting, and as I think as you were talking, I was kind of thinking about that as well. And one of the things that you were talking about was improving spiritual life, and the metrics are different; they're not quantitative, and the fact that it's about sometimes setting an intention forecast. And in many ways, if you look at some of the books that were written in the start of the 20th century, there were many, many writers who saw mass industrialization happening, like the Model T kind of Ford and so on at the time. This mass industrialization project happening, and there seemed to be like a dehumanization. And there seemed to be a flight from quality. Traditional guilds for artists and workers were being destroyed as machinery and factories and production line took over. And so there was this focus on quantity rather than on quality. And that, I suppose, that sort of mass production system has then permeated so much of our life, even to the extent that it's permeated kind of faith-based organizations now. So I was just thinking through that as you were speaking there. And I guess to answer your question about kind of modern day corporate culture, and modern day corporate culture, one could almost say really goes back to perhaps the last couple of hundred years, but certainly the 20th century and 21st century. And I think one of the things that modern day corporate culture does from the 19th century onwards, it really worships success,
Mm.
right? So modern day corporate culture worships success, right? It loves these big, corporate captains of industry, right? Doesn't matter how they got rich, but they're successful. And I feel, and I've heard you speak about this in the past as well. I feel that a lot of this, some of these ideas come from writers such as Max Weber, the German sociologist and economist, and his book, the Protestant Work Ethic and Spirit of Capitalism, where they were really emphasizing that business is very much a secular calling, and this notion of the prosperity gospel, right? So that if you are, business is business, right? And then if you have worldly success, if you're rich, if you're famous, if you're well-to-do, that means providence, i.e. God, destiny, higher power, basically favors you. And if you're poor, well, God doesn't really like you. And if you look at it from that perspective, well, in every culture in the world, across every religious denomination, most of the prophets and the sages and the saints, well, actually, they were very poor. They were really poor, but they were the exemplars for humanity. So the whole metric of how success is seen is kind of just upside down, really. And I think, and then in the much more modern period today of the kind of corporate culture that we have, I think some of that's also fueled by popular culture and the way, even if you look at Hollywood movies, right? So what's one of the most popular Hollywood movie genres? It's the heist movie, right? It's the heist movie. It's like The Sting or Ocean's 11, whether that's kind of the more recent one, or the older one. I think there was Ocean's 11 made in the 60s as well, if I'm right, or 50s, I think, with
Dean
Frank
Martin.
Sinatra or something, or I can't remember who made it, but anyway, whoever's in it, but not the George Clooney version. But what is it about? I mean, these films are basically about a bunch of thieves, right, who are stealing from some other thieves. right? That's what these films are about, right? A bunch of bad guys who are stealing from another bunch of bad guys, but the first bad guys, well, they're kind of cool, and the other bad guys, they're really bad guys. So what Hollywood, I think, does with these kind of movies, it popularizes that bad boy culture, right?
Hmm.
And then you see that in the movies, whether, it's John Wayne in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, or it's Sylvester Stallone in Rambo, or it's Ryan Reynolds in Deadpool, the good guy who breaks the rules and gets away with it and gets results, right? It's fine. It's okay. So
Hmm.
that bad boy culture, I think, it might seem, well, what's wrong with that? But I think there's a flip side to it, which is the fact that, that same kind of culture, that same corporate culture that loves success, loves a winner, right? Everyone wants to be a winner, right?
Hmm.
What it doesn't have any patience for is a loser. No one wants to be a loser because a loser is seen as really bad, right? And that kind of that pressure then I think creates a sense where people want to break the rules and try and get away with it. And if I remember, there was a study done by the social psychologist Michael Lerner, and he did this really fascinating set of experiments, and he said that the worse someone is treated, okay, the more likely that observers, people watching what's happening, they will say that that person who's being treated really badly, they're actually flawed.
Hmm.
So, this is a really interesting academic study. So, the worse you treat someone, okay, the more likely people who are observing that situation say, well, he probably did something wrong. He deserves it. He had it coming to him, right? And he calls this the just world hypothesis. And the just world hypothesis says that people have a need to believe that their environment is a just and orderly place where people usually get what they deserve. Right.
Hmm.
So the worse you treat someone, people think, yeah, well, must have done something wrong. And so, and so, what happens in a business setting, right, organizational setting, is that people then want to try and get away with it. They try and break the rules and get away with it. And of course, then that kind of just world hypothesis, you see that playing out in geopolitical contexts where the victim is then made out to be the aggressor and so on. And of course, that's a entirely very large subject in and of itself as well. But I think, yeah, so corporate culture definitely, I think, has, and that popular culture definitely has that component there whereby there are more kind of moral shortcomings. But that's kind of, I've spoken a little bit there about kind of modern day corporate culture. But do you think that same thing, that same thinking and the same ideas and same kind of forces at work there, do they also affect faith-based projects and organizations? And if so, in what way?
That's also a very interesting point, interesting question. And I think, one thing we need to recognize that I think maybe people who are considered religiously minded or faith based or so forth, you are not necessarily any more immune from these sorts of forces and mistakes and or moral failings than say someone who's not necessarily. I mean, you shouldn't assume that at the outset. Maybe you have a level of awareness and to be wary of those things, but there's nothing going to be intrinsic or essential about you that's going to be different than someone who's let's say not part of any particular faith or not making the decisions based on a particular faith. And I think that's important because if you look at a lot of how these call them dawah efforts or initiatives and projects and things, and there's quite a number of them. I remember before kind of let's say social media and uh, Instagram and Facebook and all of these ways to get the word out to people. It was the landscape was much different. You had basically the traditional kind of faith-based organizations of like say a masjid, and I think you're coming from the UK, very similar there. That the local community would gather, they would collect money, collect funds to build a mosque, and then they'd appoint a board and an imam and so forth. And that pretty much also kind of the model, I think, in many of the, at least the Western countries where, you have to privately solicit funds to get these things done. And that was the case in the United States and Australia and Canada and UK and so forth. And so that was pretty much the landscape of like a faith-based organization. But now you have this proliferation of, and I have to say, there's a lot of exciting elements to it. There's a lot of creativity, and people talk about the space and spaces, and and you have people who call themselves Muslim entrepreneurs and Muslim strategists and Muslim this and Muslim that and so forth. And a lot of them maybe have an entirely an online presence, but nonetheless they have a reach, maybe sometimes millions, right? That they can get to that's quite different than before. And one of the observations I have, I think there's a lot of positivity to that, but I think there's a lot of things we have to be wary of. And if you look at the culture of trying to penetrate this space. So I think you said earlier something about the, revenue share, make it more profitable. And I think in the online world, the goal towards that is to go viral, right? Is that what they say? People, they go viral. So you want your idea, your concept, your organization to all of a sudden, just proliferate to the degree that when you had, maybe hundreds or thousands of people following you the other day, now you have millions. And then there's actually ways to get revenue from having those many that many people in tune to your content, and that's a whole other thing, right? Content. We look at things that we put out on the internet as content and content creation, and it could be even something that's spiritually based, but it would often be looked at or perceived as something that is content. And then when you have content, then you have also this other concept that creeps in, which is called branding, as you're well aware of. And so you have a brand, and you have to protect your brand and so forth. And a few years back in the States, I'm not going to mention names, but there was even lawsuits that were filed between different individuals who used to be part of the same organization because somebody left. And now they're taking something of that, what they call it, industry secrets. And at the end of the day, it was all about dawah, right? It's all about teaching people the Quran or teaching them, about their faith. But yet, when lawyers got involved in this sort of thing, these terms came up, and branding and what's your brand and strategizing about all those things. So I think these things we have to be very, very careful about, because that thing we mentioned in the very beginning, the allotment for the ego, right? If you have if you're your website and you're able to look at the metrics and you see that all of these people coming in, and that's a lot of attention that you're receiving, and the ego loves attention, right? And even they may be faceless, right? One of the things that I think also about this environment is you may be reaching vast numbers of people quantitatively, but qualitatively, how much impact and effect are you having? They're consuming your content, but can you consider it to be a teacher-student relationship, for example, if we're talking about in terms of dawah and teaching people about their faith? Do they have any sort of relationship with you outside of the medium of the screen? Or they don't really know you and you don't really know them, and all they see is this content production that is put out on the YouTube or on the Instagram or whatever it might be. And I've talked with other people involved in these projects, other scholars, and many of them have their own channels, and they're doing their own thing, and they see it as a very good thing, and I don't disagree with that. But I also think that we should not conflate it with what would be a more traditional medium of imparting knowledge, and that word that we use a lot, sohba, right? Can you have sohba via a content producer and a content consumer? Is that like the true? Is that a form of sohba? Open-ended question. But at least we can say that if you have a more personal relationship, and even if it's still via screens, but it's one-on-one, or they know your name, they know your name, you're talking to them, that maybe more of a qualitative or impactful way of imparting this sohbah. And oftentimes we talk about transmission of knowledge can happen via one of three ways. So it can happen via the written word. You can read a book that somebody wrote and then you take it, and obviously you're going to benefit. Or it can happen orally. I'm speaking to you, you're talking to me, you hear from my mouth to your ears, and so forth. And then orally with the aura, from the aura, from the hal, from the state of the person, right? Just being in their presence. And people who've never experienced that, have actually been in the presence of someone who actually changed their state just by being in proximity to them, they won't be able to relate to that. It's something that has to be experienced. You can't really describe it. to anyone else. And I think the prophetic model incorporated a great deal of that. By all accounts, the Prophet ﷺ was a man of few words. He was not verbose. If you look at the khutab, the Friday sermons, or any time he would speak, it wouldn't take more than a few minutes. It would half a page or something. He didn't speak for long. He was very deliberate in the way that he spoke. Sometimes you repeat something 3 times for people to get the message. And the Arabs, they used to say al-balaghatul ijaz. So being eloquent is to be concise. So that was kind of one of their virtues in terms of oratory, at least. But then that leaves, well, then how did he affect people? And I think that the answer is just his presence, just being there. Just people would come and ask him questions, and they would be very morally dubious about the things they wanted to do, and then they would make a remark and say, before I entered and I sat with the Prophet ﷺ, this was the most beloved thing to me, something morally dubious or haram. And then when I left, it was the most detested thing to me, just by one sitting. And it wasn't just lip service. Their heart became changed. They were transformed. Right. And I know this is about moral leadership, but obviously there's another leadership style called transformative leadership and servant leadership. And obviously those models, I think you find elements of that in the prophetic leadership of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So I think there's room for all of these things, but I think we have to be careful about where we place them in terms of how effective they are and what they're there for. And we also have to be wary about the pitfalls that can happen in either face-to-face, obviously, but even in faith-based organizations that have this large internet outreach. And it's just, production of content is more like the vibe. I think we have to know its limitations as well, and not conflate it with, let's say, a true kind of spiritual discipline program if it's merely just content that you're consuming off of the internet. So, yeah, there was some thoughts.
Yes. Yeah, just on that. So I guess I don't know, this is partly maybe the way we live in the modern world today, the fact that there are so many people who are distributed, all over the place. And traditionally people used to live with their families, they would live with a community, you'd know everyone, and you'd have your teachers and your guides in that community, and you'd have access to them. So you'd have access to their aura, AURA, and the knowledge would be transmitted orally as well because you were there. But now everyone is so dissipated all over the place, but people still feel this need to, connect. And so they end up, probably less so reading now and more consuming in terms of watching and listening. So they're still trying to do that. But there's not many people, perhaps, that what they're struggling with is having that sense of sohbah, having that sense of community. And I guess, maybe, some of those organizations that are reaching out to a lot of people, I guess they are fulfilling some kind of, need there in terms of, because otherwise those people would have access to nothing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. Definitely they're fulfilling a need. But are they fulfilling the entire need? I think is the question.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, no, good.
So, yeah, that's my piece, but I think to take it back to you, you had mentioned earlier about the framing, we're talking about the impact of modern day corporate culture, and you kind of touched upon some of the points that, people always love a winner and they hate a loser, and I think that permeates the culture, but if you can elaborate that, what do you think really is the root of the issue itself that's led us to this, let's say, particular juncture, how, we're doing things today and relationships, and obviously that includes leaderships and followership and so forth.
Yeah. So I think at the root of this is really maybe, let's look at it from two ways. There's an economic dimension, which I've kind of alluded to a little bit. And then I think there's a psychological dimension. So the economic dimension is the fact that, when everyone wants to be a winner, maybe you've been given a target at work, market's changed, but your boss doesn't want to hear that the market's changed, right? So what do? You try and bend the rules. You try and pull the next quarter's revenue into this quarter. You kind of massage the numbers just to make sure that you are delivering to your boss. So your boss is delivering to their boss. and up the chain. And so no one wants to be the one who kind of lets the team down. So I think there's that thing about that to some extent drives that kind of moral, kind of wrong behavior in that way. And then I think there's the other aspect, which is a more psychological dimension, which is really I think this idea of cognitive dissonance. Now, cognitive dissonance is really that feeling, that inattention, that dissonance, that I don't feel good about this. Like, you're doing something and you have that dissonance that, oh, this doesn't feel right. Yeah. I'm a good, upstanding person. I shouldn't be doing this, right? Now, what happens in some cases, if you look at the management literature, it's to remove that feeling of dissonance, of feeling uneasy about maybe something you're doing which is morally ambiguous. What people start to do, they start to change their beliefs about
Mm,
what's right and wrong. So rather than stopping the act, they start to justify it. Well, maybe it's kind of okay. And then as you start to do that, then the act becomes okay and you take a step. And then you start doing something else, which normally you probably wouldn't have done. But then you start to change your belief system again. Well, maybe that's okay. And then you take another step. And so you go down this kind of slippery slope of
mm,
actions, step by step, all the while you're rechanging what you believe. And I think that really, to me, comes in part because most people haven't thought about what do I really believe?
mm,
What do I really genuinely believe? And how does that belief uh, imbue itself and manifest itself when I'm in a working environment, when I'm on the road and, there's some guy just cut me off the road and, how does that come across, right? Or, your kid's giving you a hard time and you feel like, oh, how does that come across? And I think a lot of that is, because we just haven't thought about it deeply. And when we think about that, then it starts to manifest itself in how we behave. And so I think a lot of the case studies you see around, where companies have collapsed due to corruption or, bad management, often you get people on that slippery slope. You get that issue around cognitive dissonance, plus you get that kind of sort of, economic aspect. But I'd be interested to see if you had anything to add to that as well.
yeah, when you were talking earlier just about kind of the economic situation, I think one of the things that I think is important to point out, and probably needs its podcast all on its own, is we're operating under this idea of perpetual growth, where the economic model is that it will constantly be expanding. And if you look at economic forecasts and how that affects the stock market, if a company comes in on a quarterly report and they don't report a forecast of better numbers than they did last year. So if they're making 5% profit this year, they're not forecasting 10% next year, then you find that their stock value goes down. When in fact their earnings are quite good and they're doing quite well and they are increasing profits, but not to the degree that the shareholders would like to see to solidify and perpetuate this idea of constant growth. And I think that's a model that doesn't work. And what you've found in the past is you have periodic collapses because it's not supportive. So in 2008, you had the financial crisis, and then there was the Black Friday, 1987, and there was Y2K, and and it's part of the model now that every few years or how many number of years, decade, whatever it might be, you're going to have some sort of collapse, and it's built into the thinking of the system. And now we have these sorts of cryptocurrencies that can go up thousands of percent in a year or so. So it's like, they're always looking for opportunities. The system's always looking for opportunities to go bigger, right? So, Bitcoin started at cents on a share. Now it's like hundreds of thousands and just bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think that leads to the pressure that, like you mentioned, and the psychological pressure that's on people and in corporations, and to always, fulfill that demand of just going bigger and faster and so forth. I think there's a fundamental philosophical issue with how we're managing all of that. And I would say from a faith-based perspective, and you mentioned very early on that most of the sages and the prophets, and they were not rich people, they were not wealthy people. And many of them could have availed themselves of wealth. Certainly the Prophet Muhammad SAW, we say that he chose his lifestyle. It's not it chose him. He wanted it to be that way. And in that, there is kind of an example for everybody. And so that nobody will feel excluded also. And that this is my prophet for the person who's not of means as much as the person of means. And you find that the arguments for those who would oppose such prophets, they would say, we only found the lowest of the low following you. They're not people of substance. They're not people of influence. And even the demand was made to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu by the Quraysh. Fine, we'll join you, but get rid of the lowly people in their estimation, because that's unbecoming for us and that sort of thing. I think the sages and the prophets and the people of wisdom, they recognize that part of that psychological pressure and to maintain that and always to be a leader in the very egoistical sense, right? That I'm in front of everybody. And in Arabic, sometimes the word sadara is used, and the sadr is like the chest. So it means you're always out in front. In other words, you compare yourself to others and you always have to be ahead of them. I remember there was a study years ago of something like people asked the question, would you prefer that you make X amount of money, or would you prefer that you make less money but you have more than other people who are like your peers? And most people chose the second option, right? That they want to feel like that they're ahead. And those are part of the dark forces within us. That's a very egoistic and nafsani impulse. And that's why I think spirituality and faith is very important, because I don't know any other way where you can combat that and get a hold on it and root it out other than seeing something is bigger than yourself, right? And God is bigger than all of us, and prophetic wisdom is what we aspire to, and it's bigger than all of us. So there's many things we could say about, many points we could make. But
Yeah. No, it's really fascinating. And I think one of the things that, we try and do in each episode is also give some kind of recommendations for the listeners to perhaps read something. And we've been speaking, obviously, in the last sort of nearly 50 minutes or so around moral leadership. And so are there any kind of books or articles or, just general media that you could perhaps refer people to help them understand, the subject of moral leadership a bit more deeply?
I get asked that question quite often. I know there have been some modern authors who've written about, like, say, the Prophet Muhammad SAW as leader, or as military leader, or as strategist, and I think it doesn't really do a good service to the concept of nubuwah, right? Above and all else, the Prophet SAW was a prophet, and we should look at it from that perspective. So to me, we need to put more effort into studying his life, into studying his character and his attributes. They should be so as familiar to us as our own character and our own attributes, and that's what I recommend to people. You want to be a good leader, you want to be a good follower, you want to be someone who inspires others, and you yourself can get inspired by others. Look at the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Look at his character. Look how he dealt with difficult people and difficult situations, and how even people amongst his so-called team, right, his Sahaba, would have objections to what he was doing, and how he spoke to them nonetheless, and how people would come in and they would threaten him and so forth, and at the same time he was easy with them and compassionate and merciful, even though the people around him, his followers, didn't want to take that course of action. But he taught them via his example, right, and via his khuluq, right, as Aisha said, his character was the Quran. And so we want to apply all of that holistically. People need to contemplate the Quran, they need to read the Seerah, and they need to study the Shama'il, and then inshallah embody it. And what would be the capstone of all of that is if you find a true prophetic heir. You find a person who embodies most of that, or all of that, or at least some of that, and you can be in their company. And this is what we talked about earlier, about this idea of sohba and the aura, A-U-R-A, obviously. And it's hard or difficult to come by these days, but it's not impossible. So for people who are looking for that route, that's what I'd recommend. And just one final note, you did mention earlier about craftsmen and guilds and things like that versus kind of the modern production line. Those crafts and guilds, they actually served as brotherhoods and as fraternities, and people did have sohbah that way. And I used to live in Damascus in the 1990s, and there was still a traditional marketplace there. And one of the things about a traditional Muslim marketplace is that all of the sellers of the same type of thing would all be in the same place. So if you wanted to go to the butcher, there'd be like 10 butchers right next to each other. And if you wanted to go get copperware, they'll all be in the same place. You wanted to get linen, cloth, all in the same place. And that sounds like counterintuitive to a modern, market thinking. Like you have to discern yourself, and then if you actually look to each of their stores, they have the same exact product. Rarely did I find that I had. Well, in fact, on one occasion, I went to someone. I was looking for something particular, and he said, I don't have it right now, and I've sold enough for today. Let me walk you down to my neighbor, and he has it. And I'm like, okay. He's leading me basically to his competitor to buy something. He could have told me, come back tomorrow, I'll have it for you. They said,
Yeah.
no, I'll show you this other person. So, these are sort of the qualitative things I think that we're missing out these days. But study the lives of these people, right? And in it, you'll find a lot that you can learn from and glean from, inshallah. What about yourself? What are you looking at? What are you reading these days?
Yeah, so I think, and actually, just before I mentioned the book, I guess what your story about Damascus there and the trader, I suppose they didn't see their livelihoods as competition with their neighbors. It was more kind of collaboration, I guess. That's what the kind of that we're all in this together. We're in the market together.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a community, right? So
yeah,
everything they saw it as being part of a community, not being the individual and I'm getting ahead. And ultimately, me getting ahead means that if I get promoted, that means 5 other guys don't get promoted, right?
yeah.
So I think that's what we mean. It's like systemic. It's built in to how we're conducting our lives today. And I think this is what's adding the psychological and emotional stress and pressure to a lot of people. And I think we have to think about alternatives and another way to do it.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Because you always feel like you're in a race, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of, yeah, exactly, and winner takes all kind of mentality. Okay, yeah. Well, the questions you asked me about what book I could recommend, I guess. Well, I guess a book on moral leadership that's I found is interesting. Is a little bit long, I must say. Is The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, and it's an interesting discourse on one particular family and this group of brothers. But one of the younger brothers, Ilyusha, and there's some really interesting spiritual dialogues that he has with his father. It's kind of almost like a murid, a disciple, and a sheikh kind of discussion. They're very,
Mhm.
very long discourses, really quite fascinating, speaking about issues of, moral questions, of spiritual questions, and really asking the reader to consider that if someone has done something wrong, should they be punished or should they be forgiven? And
Mm.
the book comes, very much looks at that whole interplay. Is it better to punish and, you did this wrong and you're going to be labeled for life, because you did that one thing wrong? Or sometimes is it better just to forgive people, to forget, give them a second chance? And that book often is about giving people a second chance. So I think it's a really interesting discourse in many, many areas, but one of those is around kind of moral leadership as well.
Mm.
So, so I think I think we're kind of like, I think let's bring the show to a close now, and I'd like to thank Dr. Waleed very much. Thank you so much
My pleasure,
uh,
Zan.
for this discussion on moral leadership, which I think was really fascinating for me. I've certainly made a lot of notes and hope to use some of the things that you said as well to some of the classes I speak to, and and we thank the listeners, of course, for listening to us about this topic, and welcome you back for the next podcast as well. So thank you all. Take care and God bless.